We have been studying branching narrative, and today I'm going to go over why we're doing this and what we've learned so far, and how we can take what we've learned and apply that to XR. The goal here of what I'm doing is to help you get practice with your critical thinking whenever you're gaming, whenever you're doing anything, analyzing experiences, whether it's a video game or an XR experience or any kind of experience. I'm trying to turn on your critical thinking and get you practicing that because it's a very important aspect of XR design. And especially if you're getting into a team environment, trying to get a job in this space, you need to learn your critical thinking. We can learn from games, and we learn from games so that we can better design excellent immersive experiences. So besides usability testing, usability research, user research, going out in the field and studying the people that you're designing something for, there's another type of research that is a part of design research. It's one of the many methods of design research, and it is called competitive landscape research, and that's what we're doing here on stream. Once we've figured out a problem that we're trying to solve, we will see how other people have solved that problem. And in this case, we are studying branching narrative. So how have other people solved the problem of branching narrative? Branching narrative is, or you may have heard the term interactive storytelling or choices matter. The way they do that is through this method called branching narrative. It is a storytelling method where your decisions change the dialogue, they change the story, depending on what you've chosen. And this is a very relevant method, not just to entertainment, but also to serious games like VR training or XR training, because I come from the background of VR training with consequences, safety training with consequences. So we would use branching narrative as our way of, if they did the safe things, then they go down this path and the story ends this way. But if they did the not so safe things, not so great an ending. That's what branching narrative does. So today we are going to be looking at what we've learned so far. So far, they've all been 2D games. We do both 2D and XR experiences. You don't have to only study XR experiences. You can also study 2D because everything that we're doing with XR, we've learned from 2D gaming. And so that is why we also study 2D games. Think about your own gaming experience if you do game. Thinking about your own experience where you are able to make a choice, and think of an experience where you're not able to make a choice. Which one feels more empowering? Which one feels more engaging? If you're just sitting there watching and experiencing something without any power, or are you able to make a decision that could possibly change the outcome? Which one makes you feel more engaged? Which one makes you feel better? That is what branching narrative can do. And what we've learned so far is that branching narrative can create a more engaging experience. And there are many different types of branching narrative available. And we've just been learning this by playing the games and observing what's been going on in them. Haven't taken any classes on branching narrative or anything. I'm getting this from my experience working on these training sims on the job in the past and playing games. How I've learned. And this is how you can learn with me. But there are different types of branching narrative. There is one type, which is called the string of pearls, where you have a linear path for the main story, but then you can branch off into side quests. And those side quests could potentially have more side quests or different endings depending on what you choose in that one. And then there's also bottleneck type, where everyone starts in the same place, but then depending on a decision that you've made, you will branch off into another story. And then those decisions can branch off, but then at some point, you all come back together at a pivotal point in the story, and then you could potentially branch off again. Fire Emblem Three Houses is a very good example of this type of branching narrative, because depending on which house you choose, there are three, you can go off into completely different stories, and it comes back together again at pivotal points in the story. But depending on what choices you've made affects that pivotal point and who's there, who's not, who's your friend, who's not, and so forth. And then there is the map of many endings, which is what I was talking about earlier with safety training, is you can have many different endings depending on your decisions. Very different endings depending on your decisions. And then there's true open world narrative, which there's no real linear path. You can choose to finish the game however you like and can choose what you do with it. And a good example of this would be Zelda Breath of the Wild, because you don't have to do the main story linearly. You could go out and you could find other quests, and you can choose what order you do the things. And you can choose to go straight to the final boss battle if you want. It's going to be really hard if you do that, but you could choose to do that, or you could choose all kinds of different things. That's a true open world system. And so all of these have their pros and cons. What that tells us is that choosing the type of branching narrative structure depends on the goals of your experience. So it depends on the type of training that you're doing or the type of experience that you're doing. And you want to know that early on up front. So this is something that I observed just by playing these games here. So in Wildermyth, there are decisions, and they're called legacy points here. And these decisions, use them wisely. So you can choose, what are we going to do here? Because this will affect how much time is spent on this, and that time spent could affect something else in the story. So where you could have made it in time to save someone from doing something, or saved a town from being destroyed or something, now you've spent all your time building a station or something, and you can't stop this calamity from happening because now you've spent too much time doing this thing instead of going out and helping. Choices matter in that case. So that in that way, it's a map of many endings. But within those individual storylines, it's more linear, kind of string of pearls in that sense. And then with Genshin Impact, that is the main story is a string of pearls, which has the main story's linear, but you have side quests that you can do. But then the hangouts, which is what we played, are a map of many endings. This is the structure of their branching dialogue. You can see it when you go into the hangout. Depending on what decision you make, you end up on these different branches, and they all have different endings, depending on which way you've gone. And then in their case, they'll show you a photograph of a memory of that ending. And you can go back and replay these if you want. So they have multiple types of structures within their game. We also discovered that whenever, and I recognized this first when we were playing Wildermyth, but whenever we're creating a branching narrative structure, there has to be some kind of constraints, because if we don't have constraints, it's going to get way out of hand. We're just going to be overwhelmed because we have to, as the creators or whoever is writing the story, and all of the people that are making all the assets and making it so based on that, it can get so out of hand so quickly that you just got a big mess on your hands. So there has to be constraints within this. It can't just be truly free. You have to have constraints on options, like in Life is Strange. I don't want to give spoilers. You haven't watched or haven't played that one, but within Life is Strange, she has a decision to make here. She has to choose whether or not she tells the principal something that happened. And so this decision is going to change what happens in the story. There are only two choices, though. Here it is: report or hide the truth. These are the only two options you have. So then if we had more options, if we gave her more freedom, then we would have to write the story to accommodate that. We'd have to write all these different possibilities of this different story, and we would have to create all of the gameplay, all of the narrative, all of the assets, animations, everything for all of those different decisions. So there has to be constraints. For an example, in this case, there's no option, there's no third option. But then we also learned that not all choices matter. You choose everything that you do here. In Life is Strange, in Genshin Impact, in Wildermyth, you choose everything. And everything affects the story a little bit in some way, like what you have in your inventory is affected. What you have in your inventory doesn't necessarily affect the storyline. Not all choices matter. That adds freedom, and it gives us that feeling of having power and control, but does not affect the game design in a way that now we have to go create all of these different varying dialogues and narratives and so forth. Like what's in your inventory, what armor you chose, or whatever. That will affect some game mechanics in some way, but not to the point where you're having to create completely different stories out of that. And then you can design it in such a way, and in a lot of these games have done this way, that you can give them a lot of choices in what they do, but that doesn't necessarily change the outcome of the end of the story overall. There are only some pivotal choices that matter that will change the outcome. And that helps the creators of the games stay focused and get something out there without getting completely overwhelmed by what's going on. We've also learned by playing these games that branches can be determined by dialogue, by battle class, by weapon choices, playstyle, actions, all kinds of things can be what are your decision points in this. In this case, it's dialogue. In other cases, like in Wildermyth, your choice of class and your choice of weapons and whether or not you decide to stay somewhere or move on, because that affects your time, which affects whether or not you can make it somewhere in time to do something. All kinds of ways that you could design your narrative to do that. It's up to you. It's up to the goals of the outcome of whatever experience you're doing, not just games, training or whatever, to figure this out. So then we also learned that there are some very interesting solutions that people have come up to solve these problems with voice acting, because if you have voice actors in your branching narrative like Genshin Impact does and Life is Strange does, then you have to have those actors voice act all of that dialogue depending on your decisions. And there could be so many decisions. And for example, if you go back and change the dialogue later because something happened and you realized you needed to change it to make something better, you have to go back, bring those voice actors in and have them redo that recording. So what we realized by playing these games is that there are some pretty interesting solutions that they've given for that. In Genshin Impact, with that game, you can choose your own name. So you can name your own character. There are a lot of games that do this, but you still have voice acting and the characters talk to you. How do they address you when there are millions of different options for your name? How do they handle that? So in Genshin Impact, for example, they will give you a title. So your title in Genshin Impact is Traveler. So instead of saying your name, they will just call you Traveler. And so that solves the problem of the voice actor trying to figure out how many possible different name combinations are there out there in the universe. Let's record one for each. That's impossible. But they can give them a title and then they can just call them the title. And then the dialogue box says your name as you entered it. So that's a solution that a lot of games do. Some people don't have any voice acting at all, but they will use lighting and sound effects and to convey the tone and the mood. Undertale does this with their sound and their lighting and their music. And Wildermyth does this. There's no voice acting at all. Sometimes voice actors, and you'll see this in Breath of the Wild, and those voice actors will play out the cutscenes, which you can't affect because it's all in the past. Memories coming up from the past. So that dialogue is played out with voice actors. However, when you're out playing in the world, because there's so many options and so many decisions that you can make, that's kind of impossible because of that true open world nature of the game. It's kind of impossible to do voice acting for all of that. So instead of doing that, they will say simple words like and they'll do very simple things with the voice acting to convey tone, and then the dialogue will say the actual dialogue of what's going on. That gives you that feeling of, yeah, I'm hearing this person say this thing. And it's really interesting how it works on your brain because you immediately convey that tone to what you're reading. It's a very good way of doing it, handling that, all those different possibilities. And then I also learned by playing this Genshin Impact game, I think it was in this first one, is that some things can really get lost in translation. Here it is. So, for example, the way she's speaking is very old Japanese. And whenever they translated that into English, it's not old English, it's modern English. So now something got lost in translation because why is she speaking old Japanese? Because even though she does not look it, she's over 100 years old. So she speaks in an old language, whereas the English is normal English.
And who if I may ask, complained? If they have any issue with me, tell them to talk to me themselves rather than waste any of your time.
So that very much got lost in translation as character development and building that she's actually much older than she looks. So whenever we do translation, and maybe they did it and maybe it's just a problem with English is boring, so it doesn't change as much, but our colloquialisms and our slang does change quite a bit pretty often. We've learned by observing this that the translation needs to be done by local first language speakers, native speakers of that language. So if you're doing an international game and you're going to translate that with voice acting into other languages, then you want people there that know that language and can properly translate those little tiny things that are going to get lost in translation into something that is appropriate to get the same feeling. You need locals to do that. Otherwise, some very key things or some important character development things could get lost in all of that shuffle of translating. And we saw that here with her and her speech, because I recognize that she is speaking Old Japanese because I studied Japanese, whereas the English is normal modern English. And then also whenever you're choosing your language, and let's see, I think Undertale has an example of that. You're wanting, whenever you choose the language, you want the language to be in the language that they speak. So some games will have all of the languages listed out in English. Italian, Japanese, German, whatever. All of it will be listed out in English. Those people don't speak English. They speak their language. So it needs to be in their language so they can recognize it. They have different writing systems. So you put it in their writing system. This is an important internationalization design thing that you want for your people so that they can easily find the language that they're speaking in. And the best way to do that is to just put it in their language. Whenever you're translating it into different language, you want to make sure that it is set up to where you can see that and set it up before they start playing the game, before you convey any kind of important information. Make sure there's an option for them to set their language so that they don't miss anything important. Make sure that's up front. Here they played the backstory before you even got to the settings. So here they're playing the backstory. There's no options to change settings that are apparent, at least. You could have pressed enter or something to make the story stop. But then how do you go back and replay the story? You have to wait for it to sit there for a while and then it'll autoplay it, at least from what I could tell. So you want to make sure that you give them that option up front before they even see any content of what language are they speaking, if you're doing international. And then you also want to make sure that the player has the ability to initiate the start. Don't just start playing immediately. This is especially important in XR. Let the player initiate the start of the game. Don't just start playing as soon as they open the game, because if you're conveying some kind of important information, they could miss it because they're still adjusting their headset. They're still getting their sound set up, so maybe they're not even hearing it yet because they haven't put their headphones in or on or whatever yet. And if you're gonna play something up front, make sure it's not something that's so pivotal to the story that they're gonna miss out on something, especially for training. So you want to give them options to manually progress the story or auto progress the story. You also, because this was something that happened in Genshin Impact, they were dialoguing while you were walking around. So you want to weigh the pros and cons of doing that, because they could miss something important while they're moving around, and especially if they're not a first language speaker of that thing. For example, I was playing it in Japanese, so I have to read the subtitles to make sure I understand what's happening. If they're having dialogue while the character's moving around, I'm watching where I'm going. I'm not reading dialogue. That is especially important for XR and especially important for mixed reality or augmented reality XR. You want to weigh the pros and cons of talking while they're moving, because they could miss something really important because they're moving around and they're paying attention to where they're going. They're not paying attention to dialogue. So this is one of the best practices that you want for XR, is to always have text with your voice. Don't just rely on voice, because they could miss something very important. If it's possible for them to miss something really important, especially for training, or for a major story, you probably don't want to have that dialogue going on while they're moving. You want that to be with them standing still and paying attention to the dialogue. Consider just doing chit chat that helps the story and gives you a little bit of lore or something, but doesn't necessarily hurt the outcome of their understanding. And then, depending on the mechanics and the goal of your game, this is going to affect your decision on whether or not you do this. Because, for example, in Life is Strange, there's a lot of background dialogue going on around the characters here in the classroom setting at the very beginning. The goal of this game, as we figured out while we're playing through it, is they actually want you to listen to that dialogue, but they don't have it set to where you have to pay attention to it. It's a choice. It's a part of that mechanic that they have in the game of, are you able to listen and glean information, because that may affect your choices. And as we go through and we listen, then these choices do change, especially if you rewind and play again, because you have the option of turning back time and redoing something in this game. If you were paying attention to the dialogue that's going on here, then you can change your choices. So in their case, it wasn't necessarily a good thing for you to manually progress, because it's part of the mechanic that you don't manually progress, because can you pay attention to all the dialogue and change your decisions based on that? Another example of where that might matter is if you're training someone on active listening, then maybe you don't want to manually progress the dialogue. Maybe you do want it to autoplay and say, can they listen? And they need to learn to actively listen. So it depends on the goal of your game. But for the most part, you do want to give them the option to manually progress. And that is what we have figured out so far from gaming. They've been doing this for decades. We can learn a ton from game design if we just study it and then, okay, how would I translate this into XR?